Senator Cory Booker is a Democrat of New Jersey who serves on the Foreign Relations Committee. Last Saturday, he was in Israel when the Hamas attacks began. This is his first interview since returning to the United States. He joins me now. It's great to have you here.
Good to be here with you in person again.
Well, let me just start because you just learned, as I did, that Steve Scalise is withdrawn, which, you know, it's not your house, but it's all of ours in the sense it's the United States House of Representatives. To the point that Michael McCaul, the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, made, it also means that certain things can't be done over there. What is your reaction to that?
This is a problem. We are in crisis right now in the country, and we have important issues we should be dealing with. Resolutely supporting the effort in Ukraine, resolutely standing with Israel, helping to aid in their defense and the protection of citizens and the evacuation of Americans from Gaza to Israel. There are many important issues, not to mention funding the government. So to have this level of dysfunction amongst the House Republicans, and especially a number of small group of right-wing folks who are undermining the functioning of government, this is very problematic at a terrible time going on in our world right now.
You were in Israel on that Saturday, on Simchat Torah, when the Hamas massacre happened in the south. You were also in the region, I believe, after that, if not mistaken. What is your takeaway back here, having been in the region at this moment of such awful crisis?
Look, I was going there on a mission because there is this pathway to peace that had opened up through the Abraham Accords. I went there to meet with Palestinian leaders, Israeli leaders, and then to continue in the region with people who really believe, as MBS said in an interview on Fox, that there is a credible pathway towards a grand bargain of regional peace, with the Palestinian principle, a pillar, being very key about it. Palestinian leaders for the first time were having conversations. In fact, Saudis for the first time since 67 came to the West Bank to meet with Palestinian leaders on a pathway to peace. And so here you have this terrorist organization whose very charter doesn't say for the destruction of Israel. The very charter is Hitler-esque. They want to destroy Jews, launching missiles. And so for me, before this, I got there early because it's a very important holiday for me personally. It's been about 30 years since, as a Christian, I've been studying Torah and really engaging in a faith that means so much to me. I danced with the Torah the night before these attacks, sat and had Shabbat dinner with friends, two of them who've lost family members. One family members were slaughtered in the kibbutz. The other had a nephew who was called up to defend folks and was killed in defending lives, innocent lives. This is a ISIS-like terrorist organization who targeted civilians in the most heinous, staggering of ways. And what's more tragic for the Palestinians, who Hamas has murdered, kidnapped Palestinians. Hamas has brutalized its own people. And what is interesting about their pattern right now, known throughout everybody I talked with in the Middle East, from journalists to business people to members of government, they all know Hamas's mission is to stop peace. And at the very moment that a pathway to peace opened up, that you heard from the Saudis, from the Emiratis, from folks in Bahrain, who understood that we had an opportunity here for a re-upping of the two-state solution, Hamas, terrorists, ISIS-like, Hitler-like folks who hate Jews and want to kill them, opened up one of the worst terrorist attacks over the last 50 years.
In terms of that peace process, there was lots of word being sent that there was a move towards Saudi and Israeli normalization, which of course would be an enormous change. I mean, one of the criticisms I've heard, and this is independent of what Hamas's motives are, which I can't really divine, and you can read their statements if you want to, is that it was an attempt to bypass essentially the peace with Palestinians, right? This idea that you would lock in normalization without resolving the enormous problem of 2 million people living in essentially a penal colony and the occupation of the West Bank. What do you say to that?
Well, that's completely wrong. I know that because I'm one of the founding members of the Abraham Accords. I've been very involved in a lot of this diplomatic work. I should be on a plane in about a week with Republicans, a small group of us, Republicans, Democrats, going to Saudi Arabia to continue these talks, because we cannot let these terrorists, this ISIS-like, Nazi-like people win. We're going to continue these conversations.
Is this going to derail that?
I stayed in the region. I just came back today because I didn't want to let it derail it. And from Americans to Arabs in the region, everybody wants to continue this pathway. And centered in it, as the leader of Saudi Arabia said on Fox News, centered in this has to be a pathway back to the two-state solution, an irrevocable pathway back to the two-state solution. And in my conversations with Senate Democrats and Senate Republicans before this attack, we all agreed, State Department agreed, this had to be about peace. And so when the very moment when you hear Arab leaders openly discussing an opportunity for peace, an organization founded to kill Jews, who after the Oslo Accords, 2014, when Arafat and Rabin get the Nobel Peace Prize and there's a pathway to peace, what does Hamas do right after that? They go after Israelis, they bomb buses, they target civilians, and then use their own people as human shields as Israel exercises its right to self-defense, hoping that the sympathy that they could maybe bring about by the people that they are endangering could somehow undermine support for a peace process. Well, we're seeing this again. And that's why the debate in America should not be a debate. We should have a crystal clarity to support Israel and to call out these Nazi ISIS-like folks who are targeting civilians with an attempt not just to kill and murder Jews, not just to kill and use Palestinians as human shields, not just to target, remember, there's Nepalese, Argentinians, French, Americans that have all been killed or held hostage through this. We have to continue the pathway towards peace and human rights for Israelis and Palestinians.
We talk about sort of human shields and attempting to sort of curry favor or public opinion. Again, you know, I think the moral responsibility for what happens in Gaza, I can't even begin to debate about whose fault it will be. All I know is that there's 6,000 bombs that have been dropped, according to Israeli Defense Forces. That's more than monthly amounts on Raqqa or Mosul during periods in which we were bombing ISIS at highest levels of sorties that we ever did, right? What do you say to people who say there are millions of civilians there? What are we doing as a U.S.?
Well, first of all, I'm in talks today about creating a humanitarian corridor. There are Americans of Palestinian descent in Gaza right now. Yeah. There are children and innocents suffering. And so we're going to continue, as Americans, do everything we can to create a humanitarian corridor. These are, again, terrorists, target civilians. Israel is a democracy, and democracies are stronger when they abide by the rule of law. President Biden has said that publicly, where you try to minimize casualties. And that is something that we all can call on Israel as they exercise their right to self-defense, to do everything possible to minimize civilian loss as these cowards and terrorists are using their own the Palestinian people as human shields. It is awful, and we need to do everything possible to help to minimize that damage. But to me, there should be no confusion about this for Americans. And I'll say this not just as a United States Senator, not just as a patriot who would die for my own country, but I'm going to say this as a black man. When you're black in America, you understand the vulnerability within your own country you love. I saw it as an adult on January 6th. The people that stormed the Capitol talked to Capitol Police were African Americans. They had signs of hatred, Confederate flags, the vicious, racist things they were saying to Capitol Police officers. But side by side, those symbols of hate towards black Americans were shirts like Camp Auschwitz shirts. Hate has an indiscriminate infection. This is why, as an American, as a black American, I will always stand against hate and stand with the people who are targets of hate. Just like the Nazis, who didn't just destroy 6 million Jews, they destroyed gay people, gypsies. I will stand with people who are targets of hate. Hamas, like the Nazis and like ISIS, are people who target with hate. I stand with Jews. I stand with Muslims. I stand with gay folks. I stand with people right now who all have a common cause to stand against Hamas, because Hamas is an indiscriminately hateful people who do not want peace. They want to destroy others and stop us from having peace. This is not complicated America. It is not complicated. We all must denounce hate and those people who use hate to destroy. That is Hamas. And so I am worried right now. I'm worried about rising anti-Semitism in the United States. I led with 3 other senators, bipartisan, to call for more resources because hate is indiscriminate in its efforts. The same hate that killed blacks in a church in South Carolina are the same people who are wielding the same hate that killed in a synagogue. And so we all need to take an understanding. Everyone has a responsibility to condemn the hatred of this ISIS Nazi like Hamas and do everything we can to try to get us back to peace, to affirming of human rights for all people in that region, and again, the protection of this country and this country's, unfortunately, too often targets of hate.
Well, let me ask you this about, I think, again, if you could wave a magic wand to get rid of Hamas, I think people would take that.
And we said this off camera. I want folks to know, when I travel to these other countries, other Arabs, they all know what kind of organization Hamas is. I was almost lectured to by leaders in other Arab countries just over the last few days about how horrific Hamas is, what the awful things they have done to Palestinians. Arab countries know how dangerous and vicious this organization is.